Hello, I'm Judy Stiles. Thank you for joining us this week on Newsmakers. We're using a slightly different format today because we have two guests on the program, and our focus is the upcoming general election, something we've heard a lot about, and it's almost here. Joining me, two representatives from the Missouri Southern Political Science Department, Dr. Will Delehanty and Dr. Nicole Shoaf. Dr. Delehanty, we've heard terms like a historic, extraordinary, describing this year's election. How would you describe it to someone?
Well, I would probably say chaotic and kind of hard to understand. As someone who's interested in presidential election politics, presidential election years are usually fascinating for purposes of thinking about who's going to win, what issues are going to be relevant for voters. But this year, you have a pandemic, you have candidates who are not agreeing, for example, on when to conduct debates, right, or interact with each other. You've got social unrest. So I think, from my point of view, it's a very difficult and kind of, I guess, for lack of a better word, chaotic environment. But I'm sure Dr. Shoaf may have, right, some other insights.
I would add confusing and exhausting to the list of interesting adjectives for the election, but I completely agree. Yeah, it's unprecedented, I think, is the theme of 2020 in general, isn't it?
This whole year.
It is.
Well, you mentioned the terms confusing and exhausting. A lot of information just hitting the voters this year. Social media, with broadcast media, it just seems like that overload of information. Are you sensing that through this election as well?
I think so. I think it depends on where people get the information from and how they try to interpret it. But I think you're right. Having information from multiple sources is one problem. It's also not helpful for people who are trying to interpret the environment and information to hear questions about whether or not information is true or it's false. And so I think that adds an additional source of confusion, right, and kind of exhaustion of trying to figure out in practice, when can I believe information? When do I have to question it? Can I believe information from one source? Do I have to go to multiple sources? So I think that makes it harder.
Dr. Shoaf, we've heard a lot about campaigns, and some people have commented how campaigns just seem to be negative ads versus "I'm going to do this for you" type advertising commercial. What's your reaction to that type of feed?
Well, the research suggests that negative advertising is what's effective. It's what persuades voters. When voters are angry, and especially when voters are fearful, those advertisements tend to be more persuasive for voters. Voters report they like positive, the warm and fuzzy ads better, the more informative ads, they like those better. But they do less to sway people's votes. And so it makes sense that the campaigns would latch on to those fear-mongering ads.
And when you look at the partisanship we've seen, especially in Washington, parties not even talking to each other, do you think that's having an impact on how this whole election's being framed and coming through?
Oh yes, very much so. The nature of the information that people access is in of itself partisan. So people usually will use information that kind of corresponds to how they think politically, so their pre-existing beliefs, and so in that sense, people are getting information that reinforces, right, that kind of partisan difference. It's also true, I think, that political leaders are using kind of partisan conflict as a way to impart, kind of pull apart, right, the electorate and to build, right, coalitions of support. And that conflict kind of, you see it everywhere, right, no matter the information that you kind of get access to, or you hear people, providing interpretations of the election. So yeah, I think the environment itself is very cantankerous. It's very difficult to kind of navigate, conflict-ridden.
Following up from 2016, which in itself was a different election, a lot of times the people at that time said they were voting against someone versus voting for someone. Are you sensing that from this election, any of those kind of comments or feelings from people?
Yeah, I think so. Depending on their partisan persuasion, I think some people are voting for a person because they, at least from one point of view, they want to return to normalcy. The idea of governing in a very consistent and kind of routine way, a reestablishment of norms and expectations for officials that have been, from some points of view, absent or kind of torn asunder. And I think, on the opposite side, the argument is that the old way of doing things is not necessarily the way we should do them. We should be doing them from some kind of outside perspective. So I think that those differences kind of play out in the election as well.
Dr. Shoaf, I know political scientists look at, research, follow up on elections. Your feelings about, 2016 compared to 2020 as far as maybe lessons learned or things that you observed in your field?
It's hard to tell. President Trump's first campaign was certainly unusual in a number of ways, and whether what we saw with President Trump's initial run is going to be sort of the new norm for politics, I think it's a little too early to tell, or whether the Republican nominee in 2024 is going to be someone more typical, right? Someone like Vice President Mike Pence, who has a long history of public service, who's obviously very conservative, but is a much more traditional candidate. So it's really hard to tell whether this is these changes we've seen are unique to President Trump, or how much of it's going to bleed over into sort of the long-term political process.
So it's something you'll both be looking at in future years, obviously, and following up from this.
Oh, very much so. Well, and the students here also respond to it. I mean, they, I mean, at least the students that I get to work with, and I'm sure Dr. Shoaf has the same thing, they understand, they see kind of this kind of behavior as kind of non-normative, as kind of violating expectations. And so we actually get to talk about, right, those violations of expectations and kind of traditional practices and those sorts of things. So, I mean, despite the environment being chaotic, exhausting, it's also kind of a great opportunity to talk about things that, you know, I always assumed to be given, but nevertheless now are subject to some discussion and debate. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
You mentioned debates earlier. The fact that we can't sometimes even agree to have a debate, and then the way the politicians, or at least the presidential campaign, is trying to reach out to the public. What are your observations this year as far as how they're trying to get their message out there?
Well, I think, I mean, one of the things that I think is kind of defining, at least since, well, probably President Obama, but maybe before, right, is this kind of use of social media as a way to directly communicate with the public. As we saw in the first debate for this presidential election year, the debate, it's very difficult to kind of get both candidates to focus, to talk about policy. They couldn't agree on the second. Currently, they're both having their own town halls independent of each other. And so the information environment is overrun, as you mentioned earlier, with lots of different sources, but then you don't have the opportunity to kind of compare in a direct way, in a really consistent way. So I think social media is here to stay. Whether or not the debate chaos that we're kind of seeing currently will stay, I think maybe, as Dr. Shoaf was alluding to earlier, is that maybe more a function of the people that are running as opposed to, right, kind of a structural change. Right,
I tend to think so with the debates, because I think the research is showing that the public opinion surveys that were done right after the first debate showed that Democrats and Republicans were concerned and not pleased with the tenor of the first debate.
So they want to see those debates. It's just how they're being presented.
Yes. Well, and to be honest with you, I mean, the idea of both candidates agreeing in advance to follow rules, to be willing to give, for example, a 2-minute response and not interrupt each other, to not be able to abide by those rules really prevents, you know, the opportunity to learn something, right, from the context of the debate, which presumably is kind of the purpose for normal everyday people, right, to watch these candidates and kind of make a decision before they vote in November.
Of course, in addition to the presidential and the national scene, of course, there's a lot of emphasis on what's happening in the Senate and the House. It seems the political party aspect is really being focused on this year. Which party is going to control the House or the Senate? What are your feelings about that?
Well, I mean, kind of what I'm seeing would suggest that the Democrats will retain control of the House. There's a potential for the Democrats to take control of the Senate, which kind of creates an interesting dynamic. Well, I mean, currently, right now, President Trump faces a Democratic House but a Republican Senate. So if the Democrats were to take over, let's say, both chambers, but President Trump were reelected, it would be, I mean, if we think our politics are divisive now, I think it would be an institutional, interesting kind of context. But I think some of the evidence suggests that the Democrats may be able to take advantage of the existing environment, the pandemic, the economic problems, et cetera, to maybe take Congress. But I don't know, Dr. Shoaf, what do you think?
Very cautious about predicting the
Of course,
outcomes of
so am I.
elections.
Yes, of course. 2016 got us all
But
cautious.
yeah, that would absolutely be sort of an added challenge, because right now President Trump has an ally in the Senate, and to lose that, I think, would definitely change how DC functions, without a doubt.
What do you see if we have Biden win? We have all Democrat president and the House and the Senate. How does that change the scope of things?
But unified government's a little bit different. I mean, especially because Biden at least from my point of view, is a much more traditional politician. He's had a long history of working in the Senate. He also has a history of doing some compromise legislation. I think there may be movement on kind of healthcare related policy. You might see questions dealing with, this kind of green investment, right, that's been discussed by, Kamala Harris. Infrastructure development, those sorts of things. They may be, kind of pursued in government the way they aren't currently, right, if they had partisan control of all three institutions, or two, excuse me.
And it's been a while since we've had that situation.
It has. Yeah, I mean, it seems like the American public tends to not enjoy unified government, that they like to have divided for a variety of reasons. But during periods of unified, we do tend to see get, more policy passed, I think.
Well, let's turn to the state of Missouri. And Dr. Shoaf, I know you focus a lot on the state politics and what's going on. How does this being reflected in Missouri as far as, we have the national focus of unrest and, concern. What is your feeling about in the state of Missouri?
I think you see a lot of what we see at the national level reflected in the state of Missouri, from Missouri's response to COVID-19 to the response to the protests over the summer related to the Black Lives Matter movement. I think sort of President Trump has set the tone there that Governor Parsons has by and large sort of followed. And so I think the national politics are very much bleeding into Missouri state politics.
So do you feel that the Republican, Democrat, whatever people are feeling, they're supporting parties versus perhaps candidates in some cases?
Oftentimes, and when you're looking at particularly lower level races at the state level, many Americans don't know who their state house member or their state senator is. And so it's not unusual for them to simply vote their party ID at that level. I think it's merely amplified in the sort of the hyper-partisan atmosphere that we're facing today. I don't think that part's really all that new.
So Missouri's had a tradition of some difference, the executive and the legislative branches and who's in control in each of those.
Yeah, and Missouri politics is interesting. Missouri has consistently moved right over the last 30 years and has become considerably more conservative. But just a couple elections ago, we had a Democratic governor. And so it's not that unusual for Missouri voters to sort of hedge their bets at that level, despite the fact that Republicans have a very firm grip on both the state house and the state senate. There's not much competition at that level.
And of course, we're in southwest Missouri, which is totally different than somebody in St. Louis, Kansas City. So what about the makeup as far as the demography, the makeup of Missouri as far as the political challenges, the urban versus rural, southwest versus, east and west?
Yeah, that's always been a challenge because Missouri used to be considered a swing state. And it's average in almost every respect because we have urban areas, we have very rural areas. A lot of our demographic measures are sort of median when you look at it across the country, which can make Missouri politics sort of interesting to watch.
Mm-hmm. So other areas of the country like to look at what's happening in Missouri.
Absolutely. It's a little less predictive of the rest of the country's behavior now than it was maybe 20 years ago. Because as I said, we've shifted a bit to the right at the state level.
Dr. Delehanty, when we talk about different areas, we talk about Missouri diversity, but what about the national scene? We see obviously East Coast, West Coast are entirely different than Midwest, as far as how that's affecting political scene.
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, you see demographic change, like for example, in the desert Southwest, states that maybe historically would be, let's say, Republican for purposes of, a presidential election are now purple, right? Mm-hmm. Or trending blue, for example. There are regions of the country that we know kind of consistently vote, right, for one party versus another. But some regions that we wouldn't have thought are competitive, in fact, I think are becoming more competitive over time. I think in that sense, it bodes well for Democrats as kind of you look at demographic patterns mm-hmm. broadly in the United States. I think Democratic constituencies are maybe more likely, right, to kind of take hold in areas where you have population change, right? So I think kind of regionally, right, we see some consistency, but then also some change. I still think you have different political interests represented by rural versus urban populations, which I think are represented in Missouri as well. So I think those differences will kind of persist.
Now, a lot of focus, and especially as we wind down the campaigns coming up on the election, everybody's talking about the key states. You know, these are the key states. What are you hearing from your students, or what are you talking about in classes when people say, well, they're not even paying attention to Missouri because, you know, we're not as important as Pennsylvania, or, you know, something. What kind of reactions do people have to those kind of feelings?
Well, the tendency, at least for me, the students always want to know what states are going to matter. And so, I mean, to Dr. Shoaf's point earlier, Missouri, I mean, in the Electoral College, right, I mean, it's kind of overwhelmingly right in favor of Republican. But the place that we kind of speak about a little bit would be the industrial upper Midwest. So, as you mentioned, Pennsylvania, Ohio, the states that President Trump were able to kind of flip for purposes of the 2016 election. I think if Biden is able to flip those back, I think he has a real good chance. So, I mean, when we talk about Missouri, I think the tendency is to focus on kind of at the level of the state, right? It's Republicanism, or Republican leanings. But one of the areas that I think is really interesting is Greene County, right? So, kind of the area of the county incorporating Springfield, an area that has turned blue kind of over time. I mean, you saw this when Missourians, right, voted for Medicaid expansion. Right. It's just interesting. I mean, the politics, at least in the level of the state, is also changing in that sense. So despite being Republican, you do have some partisan change, especially in the southern part of the state.
I know you mentioned the different demographics. We've heard a lot about, I guess, efforts, of course, being on a college campus, but saying get the young vote out. What are you hearing from students as far as, the interest in wanting to get out and vote or be involved? Or, we've heard so much promotion for that.
They have lots of information, although I probably would defer to my colleague because she's actually been really active with getting students mobilized to, participate and kind of cast ballots. So, I mean, maybe you would have a better view than I would.
I think this election is exhausting and confusing, but it has been great for student interest. Students seem much more interested in making sure that they're registered to vote. I know the Political Science Student Organization held a series of voter registration drives, and we're able to get a bunch of students registered who hadn't been registered. They've answered lots of questions about how students from out of state can get absentee ballots and how that process works. And so I think student interest is higher than normal. I remember when I started teaching full-time in 2012, and I it was hard to convince students that any of this national politics mattered and that they should pay any attention at all because it was comparatively boring. But we don't have that challenge right now. For better or worse, national politics is very interesting. And so I've seen a sharp increase in student interest in voting.
Now, Dr. Shoaf, you mentioned absentee balloting, which is no matter what your age, people have been talking about it. Uncertainty on how you do it, what it involves. What are you hearing from the students along that line? If they're not home to vote, how do they do it?
Yeah, students have always found the absentee voting procedure confusing when they're out of state, and it's no accident. Not all states try to make it easy, and there's a lot of variation. Rules around early voting, absentee voting, mail-in voting vary a great deal state to state, and can change over time when party control of the state changes. And so it is a really confusing process. And so we had lots of students come in with questions, like they're interested in participating, but maybe they're from Texas and they know they can't get home on election day, so how can they vote?
And the state of Missouri itself has some new, rules or ways to play the game or do things this year as well.
Absolutely, not just new rules, but temporary rules. The mail-in voting process for Missouri, the law that made that possible, is temporary. It's only in effect for this particular election. And so you can vote absentee, either in person or via mail. If you want to vote by mail, but not for absentee reasons, that's a new process. And the state of Missouri distinguishes between the reason why you want to vote by mail. Some of those reasons require a notary to sign your ballot, others don't. And so that entire process is confusing for people.
So were you anticipating, Dr. Delehanty, an increase in absentee vote, mail-in voting this year? And we've heard early on now that there's the county clerks are reporting they have a lot of requests.
I think so. I mean, I think if you look not just maybe in Missouri, but nationwide, there's been a lot of early voting, for example, but there's been a lot of mail-in balloting. I think, and I could be wrong, but my sense is that the existence of the pandemic, really, is encouraging, kind of getting people to participate in different ways. Which is kind of very fascinating. Only because it does create a time lag issue, which is So, people are casting, right, their ballots via mail, but then it takes time for, right, the mail to obviously arrive and to count the votes. So it adds an additional level of complexity. And then, as Dr. Shoaf was kind of discussing, I mean, the complex rules associated with casting your mail-in ballot, I mean, it has the potential to dissuade some people from participating, even if they would want to do it that way. And for states to make distinctions on the basis of the reasons why people would want to, have mail-in balloting also suggests questions about, voter access and those sorts of things. So I mean, the change in the process is, I think, in part a reflection of the pandemic, but it also kind of makes you look more specifically at voting itself. So, I mean, access to the ballot box, access to, right, mail-in balloting, access to notary publics, those things that you need to, in fact, cast your ballots are very different this year than it would be, say, in 2016.
It's a big learning curve for everybody.
Very much so.
Tying that
I think
together.
so.
Well, Dr. Shoaf, I know in the state of Missouri, in addition to the candidates on the ballot, you talk about the governor and the other statewide races and the local legislators, we also have some questions. And we've seen a lot of campaigning, of course, for one of the amendments, Constitutional Amendment number 3. And I just took out 2 pages in the newspaper trying to explain what this involves. Are you finding people maybe concerned about what's in those amendments, what they mean?
Yeah, once people start to pay attention to it, because again, there's so much going on with national politics, the presidential race. There's a new chaos every day. And so when people finally start to read their sample ballots that get sent out, I've had lots of questions from students. We've talked about it in several of the classes. Because Amendment 3 is structured, there are 3 separate things being discussed in Amendment 3.
So it talks about banning gifts from lobbyists, reducing legislative campaign contributions, and redistricting. So
yeah,
this is
Amendment 3 is a little problematic because it does eliminate gifts from lobbyists. But the current law in Missouri is that gifts from lobbyists to our state legislators cannot exceed $5. So I'm not personally super worried about my legislators being bought off for $5, and that's the only change that's being made on that part of it. Amendment 3 reduces Senate campaign contributions for state senators from $2,500 to $2,400. So again, a very minor change. The meat of Amendment 3 is really overturning the statewide demographer that would do the redistricting, which is something that was added to the Missouri Constitution just in 2018. 62% of the voters in Missouri voted in favor of it in 2018. And now is up for basically a revote.
Do you find that when people see multiple aspects or confusing amendments like this, the chances are that it's going to face a bigger challenge trying to be approved historically?
Yeah, I mean, it's harder for people to understand what it is they're voting about. Whether that encourages them to vote no or not, I think is a little hard to predict. I don't know.
Well, I mean, it sounds like from Dr. Shoaf's analysis that, I mean, in part, Amendment 3 is a way to kind of avoid questions of gerrymandering and kind of incumbency advantage that Missouri voters were trying to deal with, right, in 2018. So, but I think you're right. I mean, the more complicated the issue is, the more likely it is that people will misunderstand or misinterpret what it is that they're, in fact, going to vote on.
Yeah, I mean, because the way it's worded, sort of to eliminate donations from lobbyists, sounds like you're trying to get tough on the influence of money in politics. The same thing with lowering donations to state senators. It sounds like you're getting tough on sort of buying votes. But neither of those is an accurate way of looking at what the amendment actually does. So the only substantive thing deals with redistricting.
So going back to becoming an informed voter, I know in past programs we've talked about the importance of the voters being prepared when they show up to vote or when they cast that absentee ballot. Dr. Delehanty, what do you tell your students and tell others as far as how do you become an educated voter? How do you find things?
That's a really good question. Well, I guess for example, I mean, for me, what I kind of tell people to do is to try to avoid using one information source. Especially the source that they really favor, because it turns out when you only use a source of information that you favor, you're maybe less likely to get access to information that would be contrary to your beliefs, and that seems to be kind of healthy. So I guess I would say multiple sources. I would use, reliable sources, and then I would kind of think, I mean, to the degree that you can, kind of think critically about the nature of the information that you're getting access to. I think to Dr. Shoaf's point, like for ballot initiatives, et cetera, it's really important to be aware of the information about the amendments, for example, and understand their implications before you go and participate. So that's kind of how I try to do things, and it seems to work in practice usually, although I'm subject to biases just like everybody else.
So do you find that when you watch those political campaign ads and they say so-and-so has a plan, but they don't tell you what the plan is, voters need to take the step and try to find out what that plan is that they're trying to promote?
Yeah, my initial reaction is, how come you didn't tell me what your plan is? That's what I want to know. That's why I find the debates, for example, frustrating, because there's lots of rhetoric, but there isn't a lot of specifics. And so for me, I want to hear specifically, what is it that you're going to do, and how are you different than, say, right, your opponent? Because I think those differences matter. I mean, how people govern and the policies they want to pass are really important for voters to understand. That's kind of a distinguishing feature, I think, of one choice versus another.
So voters, Dr. Shoaf, have a job to do some more investigation on their own, find out what's being said.
Absolutely, and it's difficult, and it becomes more difficult over time, but it really is. It's the only way that you get to keep a democracy. Democracies are not self-sustaining. Voters have to be reasonably well educated. They have to participate, because in the absence of active participation, the people who are already in office will manipulate. They think they're doing the right thing, but they'll do whatever suits their interests. And so it's a heavy responsibility, but it's democracy.
And of course, this is the chance to go out and vote, democracy in action in November. And
Absolutely.
I'm sure that, I don't know how soon we could talk afterwards to analyze it, but I'm sure you will be ready as political scientists to take a look after
Oh
things
my
are
gosh,
finished.
yes. That'll be fun.
And see where on your students will continue to talk about it in future years as well. So I'd like to thank you both for being on the program with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And I'd like to thank you, the viewers, for joining us this week on Newsmakers. I'm Judy Stiles. Hope you can join me again next week at the same time on this station. We'll see you then.